Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Friends, India is supposed to be a secular democratic republic. You know, India, the term secular was introduced into the Indian Constitution, into the preamble of the Indian Constitution in 1975. According to that, not only secular, you know, India is supposed to be secular socialist, secular democratic republic. Now, the term secular was introduced into the Indian Constitution in 1975 by the Indira Gandhi government. Actually, it was not really necessary to introduce this term secularism, because the Constitution itself expresses secular values, and there was really no need to emphasize that. Having done that, what is interesting is that the term secularism or secular has not been spelt out. This is a major issue in our Indian in the way in which the Indian Constitution has been written. Although secularism is breathed through through the Constitution, the term secularism itself, has not been clearly defined. I think nowadays it's become quite difficult to define the term secularism for a variety of reasons, into which I don't have to go right now. But what's important is that if India is a secular republic, then it should, what should be its policy towards minorities? Shouldn't the policy imply that the minorities should be equal participants in the economic progress of the country? Of course, it implies that secularism implies that minorities should become part of the economic progress of the country. There was also an assumption in the early days of independence that if economic development progresses on its own, every sector of the society will get secularized, in the sense that people will find, if there is economic development, it was anticipated that this economic development will dissolve the identity, social identities of caste and community, religious community, of tribes, and so on. But unfortunately, this has as I have mentioned, in the case of castes and caste and tribes, this has not happened. The identities have, in fact, over time, for a variety of reasons, the nature of economic development that has occurred, in fact, has in very many ways enhanced the salience of caste and tribal identity. This is also, what about minorities? If you look at the participation of minority in mainstream economic life, you will find that many minorities have advanced. Whether it is if you take the Parsis, the Jews are also a minority, but a minuscule minority. Parsis are also a minuscule minority. Then the Christians, all right, and the Jains and the Buddhists. Buddhists are Buddhists are, there are two divisions among the Buddhists: the neo-Buddhists who have converted to Buddhism, and the other Buddhists. Buddhists are tiny. That original Buddhists are a small minority. But in any case, these communities have not felt alienated. But the case of the Muslims is a special case. Incidentally, I want to mention here the Constitution gives special privileges to minority communities. It says that minority religious communities, not minorities are also language groups, but the Constitution, but more and more the term minority is used to refer to minority religious communities rather than linguistic group. Only when it comes to the Muslims, it becomes a complex problem. The participation of Muslims in mainstream economic life. Partly, this is because we'll have to study why is this the case that Muslims inclusion poses a complex problem. We have to examine this in somewhat greater detail. But in order to do that, we should know that Muslims form nearly 16% of the Indian population, according to the estimates of what is called the Prime Minister's High Level Committee of the Government of India, which was set up which gave its report in 2006. This committee, this high level committee, was the report of the committee was titled as Social, Economic and Educational Status of the Muslim Community in India. This is the report of this is called also the Sachar Committee report. This is a very this makes a historic, this is a historic, this is the first time, this is a historic report in the sense that is the first time there is an authoritative collation of data on the Muslims in India and on their social and economic status. This is, nowadays this is used as a benchmark for gauging whether the Muslims have, whether economic development is becoming an inclusive process vis-a-vis the Muslims. To begin with, when I am talking about Muslim, I have to refer to this report rather extensively, and I will do that. To begin with, I want to point out to you that there is the title of I want to point out to you the title of the report refers to Muslims as a community in India. This for anthropologists and sociologists, this term community poses a serious problem, because if you look at the members of this religious community, look at the the culture and cultural practices and customs of Muslim, of the Muslims, you will find there are several sects among the Muslims. Not only there are several sects among the Muslims. Muslims also have imbibed the caste practices of Hindus. That is one. And then there are diverse sects among the Muslims. And more interestingly, if you look at if you look at these anthropologists who have studied these Muslims in India point out there are widespread cultural differences. Professor T. N. Madan who edited a book titled Muslim Communities in India in the 1950s. He titled his book as Muslim Communities in India, and not Muslim Community in India. And it was appropriate because there were wide cultural there were wide cultural differences amongst different communities, whether it is Dakkani community in the south, whether it is the North Indian, the Muslims of the Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb, or Muslims of Bihar, or Muslims of Lakshadweep. Muslims of Lakshadweep, for instance, as they had although they were devout Muslims, they practiced matrilineal kinship system, in a matrilineal inheritance system. So there were wide diversities of practices amongst the Muslims, and this is quite natural too, because most of the Muslims in India, the majority of Muslims in India, are not outsiders. They have been their insiders. They were converted to Islam during the converted during over a period of 1,000 years, because this conversion more than about 1,000 years actually, this conversion, although they were converted, they have retained many of the customs and practices of Hindus. In fact, even today, I can point to the fact that many of these Muslim communities, especially if you look at the Hindustani classical music, their traditions, you will find there are so many. It is this Muslim tradition of gharanas, has absorbed Hindu rituals and practices. For instance, Ustad Alauddin Khan of Kirana Gharana was a devotee was a staunch Muslim, but at the same time he was a devotee of Saraswati, Ma Saraswati. He named his daughter Annapurna Devi and got her married to our famous sitarist Ravi Shankar. So this is and then there are even today among the Muslim among the Muslim Hindustani classical music traditions, there is the tradition of worshipping Saraswati, Mother Saraswati, before an initiate starts its practice. They tie the kankan to the guru has to tie a thread around the wrist of the ustad has to tie a thread around the wrist of the chela, saying accepting him as his guru. This kind of guru shishya parampara was very strong. In fact, in Kashmir, for instance, Kashmiri Islam was supposed to be Rishi Islam, because they had absorbed several of the customs and practices, meditative practices of the rishis of Kashmir. So there was, and then even today, there are many households in India where Muslim peers, the Sufi peers, come and perform rituals and bless and contribute to the welfare of these households. So much so that many of the Muslims are not able to, many of these households are not clearly able to say whether they are Muslims or Hindus. And the famous example of our background music, South Indian Rahman, who is the doyen of, who has become the doyen of film music today. His biography is very, very, very moving biography, because he says how he converted to Islam because, of the fact that when his family was in dire circumstances, dire poverty, facing dire poverty, it is a Sufi saint who came and not only assured him, who sort of used his magical powers to turn his life around. Today, that's why he converted to Islam. So, talking about conversions, of course, in history we would like to hear gory stories of how, Muslims, jihadi Muslims, were brutal in attacking, in using the sword to convert idol worshippers into Islam. And you hear stories of Muslim, princes having done this, having brutally, killed and destroyed, various temples and, several, for instance, you hear stories of Tipu Sultan, killing on a mass scale the Nayars of Kerala and destroying their houses and all that, and converting them to Islam. But also there is historians suspect that the conversion on a large scale occurred through peaceful means, through the efforts of the Sufi saints who wandered around, like the sadhus in different parts of the country. In fact, in this context, I also want to mention that there are the folk traditions amongst the Lingayats. There are very many folk Hindu traditions with strong cultural traces of Sufis, and there are many of the practices are also practices of are also regarded as practices of Hindu practices, but at the same time they have absorbed the Muslim Sufi culture of worshipping the Sufi graves in a very very important and interesting way. So what I am trying to say is there has been syncretism in India between Hinduism and Islam also, that has taken place at a peaceful, without the sword of Islam hanging over the head. But having said that, now let us see whether, the point is that to ask whether this, the term community is in itself justified. If you look at the processes, the cultural processes that are, that globalization has brought, you would know that, one of the consequences of globalization and rapid globalization, especially in the 21st century, is that Islamic fundamentalism has taken deep root in different parts of the world. It's not only taken deep roots in different parts of the world, and many of the secular problems of Muslim countries, secular problems that Muslims face, have been Islamicized. For instance, if you look at the problem of this thing, of the Palestinians, it was first of all regarded as it emanated as a national problem of national identity of the Palestinians who wanted their own territory. Now it has become an Islamic problem, a jihad problem. Similarly, the Afghanistan problem was converted by the US and the Pakistani military forces who wanted to oust Soviet Union from from its occupation of Afghanistan. They converted it into an Islamic jihad issue. Similarly, now Kashmir has become an Islamic jihad issue. So these fundamentalist trends have, made sort of have forced some kind of homogenization. Although there are still very divisions in these fundamentalist streams, there is a forced homogenization in the attire of Muslim women. They are now more of hijabs and more of this thing. Hijabs and burqas. You can see in the streets, everywhere you go, whether it's in the city or in village. And then similarly, you will find that Muslims have the male Muslims are donning beards and skull caps to proudly assert their identity. To a certain extent, this trend is an indication of the upward mobility of the Muslims also. When just as among the Hindus, when a caste or community becomes upwardly mobile, what it does is it also adopts with a vengeance. It goes back to its roots, as it were, adopts with a vengeance customs and practices which are Sanskritic in nature. In terms of vegetarianism, in terms of becoming more orthodox, going to temples and performing all the Vedic rituals, in weddings and so on. All right, and this kind of thing also happens amongst the Muslims. They also become more and more Islamicized, and I can give you evidence of this in the villages around the Lake Pulicat, which is a brackish water lagoon, where the shrimps and there you get very it became famous because from that place the fishermen around that lake can catch in shrimps and in brackish water the shrimps grow. They catch them and sell them at exorbitant prices to the world market. And you find there are Muslim communities, Muslim fishing communities and Hindu fishing communities, living, villages living almost side by side along the, along the coast of that lake. But what you find is, as these communities have prospered, yes, prawn cultivation. As these communities have prospered by selling prawns and shrimps and so on, you see, the prawn, if a boatload of prawns can go, on a good day, can go for nearly at that time when I was visiting that place, a boatload of prawns can be sold easily. Once it's brought to the shore, it can be sold easily for nearly 1 lakh of rupees, all right, easily. Of course, there were also bad days, but on the whole, the point is these communities started prospering enormously. One result of this prosperity is that the festivals conducted by these communities became more ostentatious and more more glaring and more blaring, because they used to invite film stars to come to celebrate their festivals, whether it is Eid or in the case of Muslims or other Hindu festivals. They celebrated it in great style, with great pomp and show, with lots of lighting, lots of dance and music, and as they did it, they became more and more, that they performed these rituals. On Eid, they used to get these, especially during Ramzan days, they used to celebrate iftar. They celebrated iftars in a big way, all right. So with using loudspeakers. And then in Muslim villages now, they, azan, they call azan with, with loudspeakers that can be heard, the azan can be heard all over the lake. So these are the trends that to a certain extent these are, I wouldn't say natural, these are social processes that can be anticipated by sociologists and anthropologists. This is Islamization. But worldwide spread of fundamentalism has given it an extra push. So in this, in this kind of setting, I think the trend among the Muslims is towards homogenization. Also the politics of the politics in the country is also pushing, the Sachar committee report says that Muslims are feeling now insecure, and because they are feeling insecure, they tend to congregate in residential areas where they are clustered. Even though they can afford to live outside, richer Muslims can afford to live outside these, these slum, almost slum like kind of areas. They are in ghettos. They prefer to live in these ghettos because there is security. They feel that outside, outside these communities, they will not have securities. In fact, this is Sachar Commission report can be extended. Not only, what's happening is that several of the urban areas in, urban settlements, you can clearly make out there are clusters of houses which are, which are Muslim cluster of houses, and then they are followed by clusters of houses of other communities. If you study the process of urbanization in India, what's very interesting is that if you look at the settlement pattern of communities in the urban, in cities and towns, you will find that the Dalits from one particular village will be settling down near in one area. The Keralites who have migrated, let's say, to Delhi, they will all be clustered in one particular area. They'll be densely clustered in one particular area, so much so that those in that area, all the ingredients, all the consumption items, grocery items that the Malayalis require are easily available. Similarly, Bihari migrants will be clustered in one particular slum, and so on. This is the way. This is the this happens because of chain migration. If one person from the village goes to the city and finds a job, and following him, he also he sort of scouts for jobs for his members of the family. He brings his members of the family. They also he scouts for opportunities, employment opportunities for the members of his household, and then and then his friends and so on. So what happens is they all congregate in a particular locality, and this is almost a what shall I say, autonomous process of that goes on, social process that develops. So this kind of clustering occurs, but that's also because many people report that there is a discrimination against Muslims in big cities, vis-a-vis the urban landlords. Muslims, if they reveal their name and if they say that they are Muslims, many of the house owners will not like them to be their tenants. They say, please, sorry, we can't entertain you. So Muslims, middle class people have to find an area where Muslim house owners are there, so they can go and settle there. So this is the way in which community consciousness develops, and I think to a certain extent Muslim community has become homogenized. The Sachar committee report investigating the social and economic status of the Muslim community comes to the conclusion that the Muslims are denied their rights from outside and they are locked from inside. It does not, however, it concentrates on how they are denied their rights, how they are discriminated against from outside, but it does not say how they are locked from inside. It leaves it to our imagination to sort of to remove. It leaves it to our imagination to grasp how they are locked from inside. But having been silent about how they are locked from inside, the emphasis that they give on the discrimination against Muslims is only partially, it is only partially right, because for instance, they give figures. They say that, for instance, Muslims educational opportunities for Muslims is has been denied for Muslim communities. They say that schools are not located anywhere near where Muslims stay. They say that modern schools are not accessible to the Muslim students, especially women. That is true, but also the ecosystem, the cultural ecosystem of the Muslims is such that the moment a boy grows up, he's even as he is growing up, he becomes an apprentice in one of the workshops, and he learns a trade, and then he prefers to become a self-employed person. So it's very important to keep this in mind, but nevertheless, it's also we should also take serious note of this Sachar committee report for one reason, that the government has to seriously think, if we want to solve the problem of communalism in India, the government has to seriously think of implementing some of the recommendations made by the high-powered Sachar committee. What are the things that they say that the share of the government benefits like loans do not reach the Muslims. They say that insecurity, the insecurity makes women sort of shut themselves up in their homes. They don't go out. There is also the notion of jihad, internal jihad, also sort of makes them sort of be aware of the secular world. You see, interestingly, in this context, Irfan Ahmad, a famous Muslim scholar, writes that he was studying the Jamaat-e-Islami, and he says the Jamaat-e-Islami was insular in the beginning because it said that politics and democracy was haram. That means it's not what Islam prescribed. So he had advocated Maulana Maududi. Later he went to Pakistan. He did not support the Pakistan movement because he said that participating in politics is not Islamic. But anyway, Maulana Maududi's tradition was carried, and this Jamaat-e-Islamiyah deliberately was against Muslim communities participating in elections and in democratic politics. But as he recounts the history of Jamaat-e-Islamiyat, he now comes to the conclusion, the Jamaat gradually realizes that it's necessary to protect Muslim interests and to advance in Muslim interests, they have to participate in democratic politics. In order and for them, they realize that secularism is very important, because for secularism is for them the ability to practice and preach their secularism affords them the opportunity to practice and preach their Islam. So therefore, they started preaching. The Jamaat-e-Islami started preaching secularism and democratic politics, and they tried to draw the Muslims out of their insularity. But and he hopes, his argument was that with progressive modernization, progressive secularization, as economic development occurs, more and more Muslims will be drawn out of their insularity. But there is the Sachar committee gives lots of data about how the Muslims, even in literacy, in fact, they say that in terms of educational qualifications, Muslims lag behind even the Dalits. But he says in on other items of socio-economic status, Muslims are only slightly ahead of the Dalit communities. This is this kind of this analysis, which is very, very penetrative, is should the policymakers should have to take the results, what the committee says, with with great interest. They should approach the recommendations also, because I think that if one should ensure that the Muslim community is increasingly going to join the secular world. It's not that if they join the secular world, if they get opportunities, employment opportunities, their employment opportunities in the government sector is minimal. Their representation is not according to the proportion of population of their proportion of population, and in terms of civic facilities also, their communities are lagging behind, and in terms of education of girls also, they lag behind. They are all slightly better off than the than the Dalit communities. So this in terms of income and so on, the Muslims are more represented, are heavily represented in the unorganized sector, not in the organized sector. And Muslim women participation in workforce is less than that of the Hindu women. If Hindu women's participation in workforce is 25% of the total workforce of women, here is only 20%, and Muslim women are not educated and so on. And this Sachar committee, high level committee, recommends that if not reservations, some kind of a principle of recruiting of diversity, it's called, to ensure that in all public institutions, diverse communities, including Muslims, are given representation over a period of time. It's a kind of a modified reservation system. Especially I would say that if this would help Muslim women, come into the mainstream, professions, that will be a great, that will, advance the interests of not only Muslims, of the whole of the country. You see, incidentally, there is, Telangana and I think Andhra Pradesh Of course, Karnataka had introduced reservations for Muslims. In they treated Muslims as backward classes, and they gave reservations for them. And so did Telangana. I think it also prevails. These reservations prevail in Tamil Nadu also. But it has been this kind of reservation has been has had very positive effects, in the sense that Muslims in these in Karnataka, for instance, Muslims occupy there are very many Muslim professionals. Muslims are in very prominent where there are prominent lawyers, judges, and doctors, and engineers, and journalists, and so on. This is because of the policy of reservations, which has included them in the mainstream. But having said that, there is the the policy of the government vis-a-vis the religious minority religious community, vis-a-vis Muslims, need to be studied in greater depth. I think that policy has had an adverse impact. How has it had an adverse impact? You see, the point is that if you look at the BJP calls it the politics of appeasement, but if you look at the government of India's attitude all along, except for the last few years, what has been happening is that the Orthodox Muslims have had a decisive say in the future of the community, because the Orthodox Muslims, is starting from the Shah Bano case, when the government yielded to the demands of Orthodox Muslims. And in fact, Rajiv Gandhi, who was then the Prime Minister, he sacked Mr. Arif Muhammad Khan, who said that we should abide with the recommendation of the with the judgment of in the Shah Bano case, because it only said that iddat has to be given, and iddat more iddat has to be given, instead of which what the Shah Bano judgment went against the Orthodox Muslims, the practice of iddat, when a woman divorces, the amount of compensation has to be given, that the judge commented on the was caustic about the Islamic practice, and said that she should be given a higher compensation. That was that led to a lot of turmoil among the Muslim communities. So what happened, even then, even in those agitations, there were progressive Muslim communities who advocated that we should not change the Shah Bano judgment, but the more orthodox elements among the Muslims had the bigger say. They outshouted these minority Muslims and into silence. So what I am trying to say is that the policy of the government of India has made it difficult for secular Muslims. All right, some say it is an oxymoron, but whatever it is, the modern Muslims, let me put it this way, modern Muslims to it struck the spaces for the modern Muslims to lead the Muslim communities. In fact, it's the orthodoxy which has a what shall I say, more powerful influence on the Muslims rather than the moderate modern Muslims, leaders who are more educated. So as a result, and also one can go on and on talking about it. What has happened is that in many respects that that the voice of the secularists among Muslims is sort of cast away. And this is also because the rhetoric, in the name of, the one of the reactionary element, the right wing parties have attacked the notion of secularism that the Congress government had been, practicing, and this has led to sharpening divisions between the Hindutva forces and the Muslims. You see, what I am trying to stress is that there has been the opportunities for the Muslim community to join the secular forces have been denied to them. The one other example is, for instance, the issue of uniform civil code. It is in the Constitution. Of course, in the directive principles of the Constitution, it's mentioned that the state should strive to ensure a universal civil code for the whole country, whether it is Muslims or Hindus. They should get the same kind of benefits from the civil code. For instance, the civil code among the Muslims, Shariat, says that the daughters are entitled to only half the property of half the inheritance, half the property, half the amount of property that the sons inherit. I think this is certainly biased against women, and of course, as we know, that triple talaq has been removed, all right, has been criminalized, but all these practices sort of repress women, repress Muslim women, and if you and the government of India, the policy of the state has always been, right from Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi also did it in the name, he supported, for instance, this is in the 1920s, one of the first things that he did after, becoming prominent in politics in India is to support that movement for Caliphate movement of Ali brothers. That the Ali brothers, the Turkey, after the Second World War, Turkey, which was a Muslim state, Muslim sultan, was defeated, and then it was taken over by a secular regime. So the Caliphate movement wanted to re-establish a caliphate in Turkey, all right, and it was Gandhiji, in his wisdom, he thought that this is secularism, and he thought that way we can mobilize the Muslims to join the freedom struggle. Therefore, he went and supported the Khilafat movement. Today, the ISIS, which is now regarded as a radical Islamic, not only radical, terrorist Islamic group, all right, professes the same philosophy. So the point is that in the name of secularism, the government's policies have always been towards promoting orthodox elements and allowing the Muslims to be locked from inside, all right. So as a result, what has been allowed to be locked from inside. Now, if we implement some of the recommendations made by the Sachar committee, there is a hope that this locking from inside, the lock that has been put from inside, can be broken from outside by the insiders, so that there will be forces of secularization that will be let loose in the amongst the Muslims, and they can also join the mainstream. and you know, it's very in a way, you know, this kind of discrimination against particular communities, you know, unequal treatment of, you know, on the basis of caste and other and so on, actually rebounds on economic performance. You know, we are the country is denied the talents that these communities are possessing, because, you know, they are not allowed to, they are denied the opportunities for getting educated, getting trained in different skills, and they are denied the opportunity to contribute to national prosperity. So therefore, I think I would say that it is high time that you know, in order to ensure that Muslims are included in the process of economic growth, you know, one serious step that can be taken is to follow the recommendations of the Sachar committee. And another step is, I think, you know, if as Mr. Modi, the Prime Minister, you know, after winning the second round this 2019 elections, said that if somehow that you know, a class division, instead of having these, you know, treating different castes and communities and giving them, you know, backward castes and communities, giving them, you know, special privileges, you know, the country has to move towards secularizing this reservation policy as well, so that there will be, you know, more of national integration possible. One thing we should remember when we are discussing the Muslim community, discussing the economic prospects as well as the social and economic conditions of the Muslim community, is that it's also internally diverse, you know, it's also internally differentiated according to, you know, along caste lines, and there are extremely depressed Muslim communities as well, and you know, a case can be made for their inclusion in the reservations list. Definitely, a case can be made for these subcastes inclusion. You know, in fact, if when we talk about it, we realize that when we compare the overall Indian situation, in the overall situation of Muslims in India, with the situation of Muslims in the southern states, you will find there's an enormous difference, because in the southern states, as I had mentioned earlier too, they have been entitled to reservations for the backward OBC reservations, and the results are there to see. They have made spectacular progress in very many public institutes, in securing jobs in various government offices, in private enterprises, in engineering colleges, medical colleges, and so on. It's in fact it's remarkable progress. So I think one case can be made, not for the weaker diversity, but for the stronger reservations for these particularly vulnerable Muslim castes, that I should stress here. Having done that, I should also point out here that in spite of everything, there are remarkable instances of an aspirational class, a modernized aspirational class joining, the mainstream of economic life. There are several instances of Muslim young men and women from Muslim communities, from deprived Muslim community backgrounds, having achieved remarkable success, whether it's in the field of law or whether it's in the field of management or becoming airline pilots and so on. So there is, in spite of not being treated as special, not being treated with special privileges, there are very many instances of Muslim youth forging ahead. And I think it's important that these creamy layer should be expanded in the creamy layer among the Muslims should be expanded, and I think this will make for greater national integration. Definitely, it will make for greater national integration, and I think there is a strong case can also be made out for opening opportunities, especially because Muslim communities are, get isolated for a variety of reasons from the mainstream social life. Extra efforts have to be made, I think, through the internet and electronic media. I think it's possible for us today to reach Muslim women and make them access educational opportunities. In this context, I want to say that in some of the southern states, both in the present day Tamil Nadu and in the present day Karnataka, the government took a policy decision to promote education among women. They used to, and women were, Hindu women were also cloistered in their homes. The government made special efforts to reach, provide them extra facilities to, while sitting at home, while being at home, studying, and passing examinations and so on. So it's possible, and once you do it, once these women who are given these facilities, they were able to become graduates and take up government jobs and so on. So this is one way by which the immune women who are confined to intramural settings can be brought out to public life and participate equally with others in the act of nation building. I'll stop here.